Are more megapixels always better?
Or do they sometimes get in the way and are more trouble than they're worth?
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Bird Photography Show with Glenn Bartley
Hey, everybody.
and me and Wegener.
Well, before we get into this episode, we just want to say a quick thank you to our episode sponsor, which once again is Camera Canada. I know for me, whenever I'm after new gear, that's my one-stop shop. Great prices, fast shipping. You won't be disappointed.
So Glenn, it's been a little while since our last episode and we've both been busy doing different projects. What have you been working on lately?
Well, my most recent photo shoot was a shoot I've been wanting to do for a while now, down in the Rocky Mountains in and around Colorado and Kansas. And sometimes people call this the chicken run. Theoretically, you could get 6 different species of sort of
Oh,
grouse or prairie chicken-like birds.
so now I wanted to show off and say all the names of the 4 chickens that I remembered, but then there must be 2 more. So I was thinking sage grouse, sharp-tailed grouse, lesser and greater prairie chicken, but what's the other 2 then?
So I threw in the white-tailed ptarmigan,
Okay.
and also there's a Gunnison's sage grouse, which is like very
Oh,
similar to
yeah.
greater sage grouse, but they're not doing so well. And so unless you have really good contacts with a biologist or someone who's doing research or something, you're not very likely to see those guys right now.
So now a lot of people will probably wonder, how do you manage to just drive into Colorado and find these birds? But actually photographing these grouses, and I've done the same with black grouses in Europe. Once you find a spot, it's actually not that difficult because they come to the same area every morning to display. It's like a group of maybe
Definitely.
5, 10, sometimes more males all displaying. And after 1 or 2 hours in the morning, it's usually done till the next day.
Each species has sort of a different thing it does. Now, the ptarmigans don't do that sort of
No.
lecking behavior. They're just kind of off in the mountains. I could hear them kind of making little contact calls to each other, and then that led me right to where they were. And then I drove down into the prairies and a totally different ecosystem to look for the prairie chickens in.
Do you find it difficult to photograph them? Because I've seen a lot of pictures and it always seems like in sort of medium high grass. So I feel like if you're too close to the ground, you probably have the whole bird covered with grass. You also don't want to make it look like they're sort of on a soccer field or something.
The way it works, basically, you make arrangements with these private landowners, people who have these big ranches. You can contact
Yeah.
them in advance. It's pretty easy to figure out online if you want to do this thing yourself. That was my big worry, was that you'd get to a site and it just wasn't photogenic. But overall, I was really happy with the different setting. A couple of things that sort of benefited me. One is that I was the only sort of person at the site, and I had my own blind, and so I could kind of set up the height of the camera depending on
Yeah.
how the topography was. And so I just sort of tried to figure out exactly the height I wanted my tripod to have, still a really nice blurred out background, but as you say, not be so low that there's just so much stuff in the
Yeah.
way. And just so amazing to just turn up in the morning in the dark and get into the blind before anything's happening, and before you know it, they start coming out of the grasses and they start doing these crazy displays where they kind of fill up this air sac and shake it down, and it makes this really weird noise, and it also vocalizations, and they're fighting with each other and chasing each other around. Just honestly a really, really, really fun shoot.
So you went to many, many different locations and seemed to be successful at all of them.
My favorite shoot, because I feel like it was one of those things where it'd be really hard to replicate it. We just got so lucky. I went to this one sage grouse lek, which was just a publicly accessible one right along the side of the road.
Oh, wow.
And it was really good. The setting was nice. You could get a decent distance from them. Everything was good. You had to shoot from the car. By pure luck, it was absolutely perfect. Just the right amount of snow, a good amount, but not so much that they don't want to display, and not so little that it's not really like consequential in the photo. It was very much a part of the scene, like even at some point like heavier snow that was in the photos. And it was just spectacular to see these birds doing their lecking all over the place, and with this snowy background. It was a phenomenal shoot to finish the trip with.
So that word pre-capture is amazing as well, because you can basically never miss this moment. If you just focused on the
Yeah.
bird, have pre-capture activated, when it will display, you're basically guaranteed to get the shot. And that's probably one of those reasons why pre-capture is so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I absolutely love the R5 Mark II. It's the best camera that I've ever used. I have absolutely no issues with it, and I just really enjoy using it. It has so much great potential to get great images. But I noticed that you have almost abandoned your R5 Mark II, it seems, and you've mostly been using the R1, a lower megapixel body, and even using shorter lenses, I noticed lately. What's going on with that?
It's one of those things, right? Once you use the R1, it's very hard to put it down. I still don't love the 24 megapixels, but I just love how the camera handles, and especially the electronic viewfinder is just crazy in it. It's like so big, so bright. It has all the perfect button in the perfect places. Like I can do 5 different things with my thumb on the AF on button. So actually in terms of usability and customizing it, it's been really, really good. And it's just so much fun to shoot with. But of course, whether you need like a high megapixel or a lower megapixel camera also depends on what you're shooting. As you say, I've been
Yeah.
mainly trying to photograph these glossy black cockatoos coming in to drink in various spots right on sunset. And this is definitely
Mhm.
where I experienced some challenges with the R5 Mark II in particular, because you often have to use 12,800 ISO, 25,600 ISO on a black bird to get enough shutter speed when it's flying in.
Mhm.
And then this is where the R5 Mark II can be a little bit tricky. Super high ISO, low light
Yeah.
on a dark bird.
Well, and also that's a big bird, right?
Yeah, they're basically almost like an eagle size. So I was using the 100 to 500 millimeter lens at around 300 millimeters, but then with that slow aperture, it was still a challenge. So I also borrowed the 100 to 300 millimeter f2.8 lens.
You were using it at 300 millimeters, and all of a sudden you were like, bing, I need to buy a new lens.
Well, I didn't buy a new lens because it's about $15,000 here, that 100 to 300
Right.
millimeter lens. I'm like, for just 5 or 6 shots, that might be a little bit too much. But at the same time, it was just something that I wanted to try out, because obviously with a faster lens, you can shoot at f2.8 or 3.2, use ISO
Yeah.
6400 instead of 25,600. So in terms of image quality and the
Huge
scope to
difference.
expose the images bright enough is completely different.
I think that's one of the things that people often forget is how powerful a stop of light can be in low light conditions, or two stops. Like if you're going to a 2.8 lens, when you're sort of thinking of the difference, like let's say between like a 500th of a second, which would not be adequate to stop the
Yeah.
motion, and two stops brighter is a 2,000th of a second. So that is more than enough. So it's actually a tremendous difference when you need that light, when you need that shutter speed. It's an amazing tool to have.
Definitely, and I always say that in most situations the gear doesn't play as much of a role, but if you're shooting in extreme low light situation, fast action, that's when the more expensive gear really shines. But this is also where sometimes the 24 megapixels can actually help, because you're able to get a little bit more out of those files because they're not as
Mhm.
noisy, and there's a bit more scope, even if you underexpose them slightly, to edit them up later on.
I have no trouble with 24 megapixels at all. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that the top of the line high megapixel bodies were only 20
Yeah.
megapixels. Unless you're printing massive, that's not a problem. But for me, because I do so much walking around in the jungle and the birds are just not often as close as I would want them, ever since I got 45 megapixels with the original R5, I would have a really hard time going back to a lower megapixel camera, I think.
It just depends on the shooting situation. And I think there's
Yeah.
obviously a lot of advantages with high megapixels. We can crop more, but at the same time, I think there's also some drawbacks. Obviously, like you need much bigger memory cards, you need much faster
Mhm.
computers, you need a lot more storage. And sometimes, I don't know how to put this, but it might make you a little bit more of a lazy photographer, where you feel like,
Mhm.
or you get into the habit, I know I can crop. So you're almost just
Yeah.
willingly cropping every one of your images. And I feel like ideally we still want to capture the images as sort of full frame as possible, right?
I think you kind of have to choose, as you say, based on what you're shooting. And like everything, they both have pros and cons to them.
I think for the average shooter, and in most situations, something in the 20 to 30 megapixel range is obviously enough. Like if you have an R6 Mark II with
Mhm.
24 megapixels, you don't have to feel bad about it. There's obviously a little less
No.
scope to crop, but in most situations, even if you want to print it in a book and not like a massive size, you'll usually be fine with that sort of megapixel range. Where the high megapixels really help is obviously if you can't get close enough, or you're able to also use the crop mode within camera. That's something you use a lot
Mhm.
as well, where you then
Definitely.
kind of crop in camera, but also bring the subject bigger in your viewfinder.
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, is like if you don't have a really big lens, like a really long telephoto lens, then it's nice to have a bit more megapixels, obviously, as well. Like if you have the luxury of a 600 f4 and teleconverters, then maybe you can get away with a lower megapixel body.
if you're just after one camera, you really have to ask yourself the questions, do I actually gain something from having the high megapixel body? Like, am I only posting on Instagram? Even a big crop is probably fine. And then a 24 megapixel camera is usually cheaper. You have a bigger buffer. You can use smaller cards. You need less storage. But if you feel like that you want to make bigger prints or sell a lot of images to magazines and still crop a bit, then in those situations, it's probably beneficial to have that 45 megapixel or even more pixel camera. Before we move on to the photo of the week, I thought I'd just throw a few questions at you that people ask me on Instagram for this video. And if you guys enjoy this sort of rapid fire question segment, you can also let us know some of your questions down there in the comments. And the first question I thought fits right in with you because in the last episode, you showed us some swifts you were taking with the R5 Mark II and the 100 to 500 millimeter lens. And one of the questions was that this guy is struggling with birds in flight and the R5 Mark II and the 100 to 500 millimeter lens. So I thought, is there any tips you can give people, any settings you were using or any standout technique that gets you those shots besides obviously finding a good spots where birds are flying right in front of you?
Yeah, well, that does help finding the right setting, but well, obviously we need to start with fast shutter speeds. We got to have our speed up, and as we know, that's not the fastest lens in the world. So you're shooting wide open most of the time, aperture wise. You're going to adjust your ISO in order to get a fast enough shutter speed. How fast depends on the bird and how fast it's flying. With a Swift, I would say you really want at least a 2500, if not 4000.
Yeah.
There's some good techniques that you can just quickly learn and do. One of the biggest ones is pre-focusing. So
Yeah.
trying to identify what's going on with the birds. How are they flying? Is there some way that you can kind of pre-focus your lens at a distance where that when the bird's flying, you can pick up your lens and that you're approximately in the right focal plane? Because if your lens is way out of focus and you go to look for it, you're not going to see the bird and the camera is going to have a hard time finding it anyways.
And hand in hand with pre-focusing, I think also goes your hand-eye coordination because you need to
Yes.
pre-focus and then oftentimes the bird will only give you maybe 1 or 2 seconds max to find it in the viewfinder, shoot before the action is
If
over
that.
again. So trying to actually find the bird in your viewfinder is also crucial to not miss the moment when it comes to birds in flight and action.
What I would say is start with slower flying birds and try to develop some of those things. Do not underestimate pre-focusing so that you can pick the bird up and get on it, and then try to track the bird until it gets into kind of the sweet spot of your light and then blast away. Another couple things, if it's fast flying, it can be really helpful to wait for the right conditions, like for example, a stiff wind. That will slow the birds down and make it a lot easier to pan with them and to find them.
And since the question was about a zoom lens in particular, I think a good technique to find the birds easy in your viewfinder is also to zoom out a little bit, find a bird, and then zoom back in to frame it nicely. That definitely makes it easier for you to find birds. And when it comes to the R5 Mark II in particular, I think both of us prefer to set the autofocus tracking and the sensitivity to auto and +1, which seems to have given us the best results. And even though it seems like the autofocus should jump off your subject more, this setting actually keeps it on your subject more seemingly. Second question, it will be a yes and no one, maybe with a very short explanation. Is the R5 Mark II worth the extra cash over the original R5?
Oh man.
Yes or
That is
no
so.
first.
Well, I bought one, so I guess I'm going to say yes. But I think it really depends. I think if you don't see yourself doing a lot of action photography and using that pre-capture, I don't know how much it's necessary. I don't know if I was like more of a hobbyist and not a
Yeah.
professional, and if I certainly didn't have an extra bunch of money burning a hole in my pocket, I I don't know that I would say it's a necessary upgrade. It's nice, but it's not really something that you absolutely need. Like, or I know this has gone way past yes or no, but the original R5 was a quantum leap
Yeah.
in technology. It was like as soon as those sort of mirrorless cameras with eye detect and those faster frame rates and all the amazing things that were in that camera came out, you really almost felt bad for people who didn't have them. That's not what's going on with the R5 II. They've refined it a lot of little areas,
Yeah.
but it is absolutely not a must-have.
To wrap up this segment, there's one more question about backgrounds. Someone asking, how do I get always these nice and smooth backgrounds in my images? That's obviously something you have in most images as well. And then also the question, how can you get these backgrounds when you're not using a big prime lens? And I say one thing here, I think it's all about the distance between your subject and the background, isn't it? It's as simple as that.
I've been telling people, like, literally imagine that you're looking through a tube, like your camera is looking through a tube. Just moving a step one way or the other way can totally change your background. Like, you're right in that you need a certain distance to create that blurred effect, but that distance might be available from your immediate surroundings.
Yeah.
If you just look past your subject, imagine a tube that you're looking through and figure out what you want to line your tangent up with, and that can really help to control backgrounds.
So it's not just the smoothness of the background, but also finding a background that sort of ideally complements your subject and definitely doesn't distract from it.
The whole point of the blurred out background, or the, like, defocused background, is to kind of highlight that the bird is the star of the show. I think it's nice when there's sort of like some mottled colors and different sort of textures, but not that it distracts, to your point, where there's like bright spots or dark spots or things like that.
So let's move on to the tweak of the week, because I think there's one particular tool in Photoshop that most people are not aware of. Because normally when you want to edit a raw file in Photoshop, you open it in Camera Raw, you make your tweaks, you open the file in Photoshop, and you're kind of done with it. You can't really go back to Camera Raw, maybe use one of the masks or use like a gradient filter on the background.
Or can you?
Or can you? Exactly. Because what most people don't know, you can create a new layer. I would definitely recommend to create a new layer or copy of your background. And then you can navigate to Filters, Camera Raw Filter. And that will basically open Camera Raw again for you. You can almost edit like if you were in Lightroom. And all the changes you will make in the Camera Raw filter will then be applied to that layer in Photoshop. So you can, for instance, use some of the masking in Camera Raw, go back into Photoshop, and then even run a layer mask on that layer and just brush in the changes in some of these areas. And that can be very helpful.
I totally agree, and I do it all the time, especially when there's like weird color things going on, or as you mentioned, a gradient in the a lot of those sage grouse in the snow photos. I was doing that quite a bit because I wanted some, separation between the sort of the bird and the background. So what I was doing was selecting the bird, going in and warming it up a little bit, then selecting the inverse and putting a linear gradient from the top and cooling it down and saturating it. So the background kind of looks more blue and white and snowy.
And there's another tip if you want really clean results, because we're always tempted to use the automatic masking in like Lightroom or the Camera Raw filter. And if you don't make drastic changes, they're definitely fine. If you just change the white balance, you don't really have to make a separate mask in Photoshop. But sometimes, for instance, if you want to brighten the background a fair bit, or you pull out dehaze to make the background a little bit lighter, or pull out some of that texture, and you use the automatic mask in Camera Raw, for instance, it can leave edges or leaves out areas. So sometimes what's better is to apply the filter in the whole image in Camera Raw or Lightroom, then bring the photo back to Photoshop and then create a mask of your subject in Photoshop, because that's generally more accurate and you can refine it more, and then you get a much better final and cleaner end result. And if you guys want to learn more about image editing, develop your own workflow that you can apply to all your raw images and learn a lot more tricks and techniques, I'd recommend that you check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses and Glenn's ebook, where you will learn to edit your raw files with ease.
And don't forget to check out our Pro Sets. If you want a one-click great starting point to give you great colors and a fantastic way to edit your images in the digital darkroom, check out our Pro Sets down below.
It's the most rewarding feeling when we actually get some great images in the field, edit them up, and then are also able to share them with a lot of other people.
Okay, guys, I think now it's time for the Photo of the Week segment. I think this week we're going to cut it a little bit short just because we did that question period. And you guys, please be sure to let us know down in the comments. Do you like that sort of question period where we kind of answer questions from the comments each time? Or do you prefer that we kind of stick with the show how it is? Or maybe you want to see more questions and more Photo of the Week and less about us talking about ourselves? I don't know. Let us know.
So the first photo I brought is from Björn Nielsen from Brazil, I think, of a blue and yellow tanager. And it just stood out to me because I thought it was a beautiful bird in a good pose on a quite nice and interesting perch. One could almost say it's a bit too big for the tanager, but at the same time it has that nice little sort of vine wrapped around it, which actually looks quite nice and makes it a very interesting overall image. And I also like just what we talked about before. It's not a completely clean background. You have these nice sort of circular sort of highlights and darker areas in it, giving you kind of the idea that it's kind of close to a tree and just sitting on a branch in the forest. And I thought the editing overall was done very well as well. So just a really nice image.
Yeah, I think for me the standout thing about this image is really the pose. Um,
Yeah.
it really shows off the bird well. It's sitting nicely on the branch, like right on top of that vine. Overall, a really nice shot. All right, the first image I've brought for us this week is by My Birds Gallery, and it's just a really cute shot, I think, of this burrowing owl. It's a juvenile bird flying right at the camera. Really nice wing pose. I think a really nice warm color palette. There's some kind of some blotchy red things in the background, but I don't really mind those. A nice kind of warm. Owls are always cute. Burrowing owls are super cute, and I just think it's a nice shot.
It's definitely a beautiful image. And again, it gives you a hint of that sort of meadowy background in the shot
Mhm.
without being overwhelming. And I also like how it transitions from like brighter, warmer at the top towards a bit darker, greener at the bottom. And definitely a nice overall flight shot and also a good shutter speed, because often what happens in this pose, if you have a too slow shutter speed, is that the edges of the wing get really blurry and then it can look funny.
Mhm.
Whereas here, I think it's very nicely frozen and just a nice overall image.
That's an interesting point. We talked earlier about sort of flight, settings and techniques. And sometimes people are like, well, what shutter speed would I need? And that's good to know. Sometimes you don't have enough light to get the ideal shutter speed. But depending on where in the bird's flight, you can still get away with some good shots. A lot of them
Yeah.
will be too blurred, but you might get some at the bottom or at the top of the wing beat where you can kind of still pull it off when you have to, when you don't have enough light.
The second and last image I brought for this week is of a blue and black kingfisher. Definitely a spectacular bird. And I picked this image because it was an interesting situation and probably one we all find ourselves in all the
Mhm.
time. We have a stunning bird in quite a decent rainforest environment, but we don't really know how to crop it. And there's obviously a few branches and trees and kind of things around the bird that make it tricky to choose a crop. And so if we go to the second part of the image, we see how the photographer cropped the image. And I think they've actually done fairly well. There's still a few tweaks I would make, but I'll throw it to you and see, how would you crop this image? Would you have done anything differently in the field? And what would you do to the crop that we see now from the photographer?
Yeah, I'm kind of imagining what this. I don't know if this was somebody was in a boat maybe, and they're kind of like going towards the bird and trying to do the best they can with the shots. Because
Speaking about boats, that drove you crazy, didn't we? When we did a Kingfisher tour somewhere, and
oh
then you're
yeah,
like, "Oh, just keep the boat there," and then the boat keeps drifting, or the driver keeps
it's
driving. You're like,
tough.
"No, no, stop, stop, stop!" And so, if this was from a boat, that would change a lot of things for me, because shooting from a boat that's moving is not a lot of fun.
No, and like I was saying, like in a perfect world, I think for this image, I would rather the photographer was significantly further to the right and shooting up through that gap in the vine
Yeah,
so that you have a little bit of a cleaner shot without things coming down. But I realize it is not a perfect world, and very likely they had some constraints as to their mobility in getting that. Yeah, if I was going to go significantly tighter, but I think I would clone out that thin vine that's cutting right through the bird's bill
definitely.
and dropping underneath. I think that's kind of my take on this one.
I think what I would do here, if we say we can't do anything else, I think cropping tighter is definitely the way to go, something that you would do as well, I think. And that's where 45 megapixels or more would also help. And in this case, I totally agree. I would remove that vertical little thin vine or whatever branch it is. I would remove that. And we talked about the camera raw filter. What I would do here as well, that you can do in camera raw or Lightroom, is probably go in and then use a radial gradient on the upper right hand side behind the bird's head, sort of up to the bird's chest, and selecting that tree as well, and then pull out a fair bit of negative dehaze, which will give it more of a flow and gradient. It will also separate the beak more from that tree and probably give it an overall nicer feel, because then it's brighter behind the bird's head, which will make the bird overall stand out more. So overall, I think a good image in a very tough shooting situation. And maybe you can let us know in the comments as well, how would you crop this image? And is that a situation you find yourself in a lot as well?
Definitely a bird I'd love to see. Look at that thing.
Oh, for sure.
Beautiful. Okay, so my second and final image this week is by Seller Bird Photography, and it's the opposite of the last one was a very loose composition. This is a very tight composition of a really spectacular bird, one that I'm very familiar with, these beautiful wood ducks. They had some nice light on the bird, and they just went for a super tight headshot. So what do you think of this one, Jan?
I think it's really nice. I remember myself shooting wood duck somewhere in Vancouver as well. There was one nice spot where just a whole bunch of them were swimming around. I actually found them quite difficult to photograph in most situations, except when you can find a spot, like what we always say, find a spot with a tame bird, and suddenly it's not that hard anymore. But definitely a beautiful image. I really like the nice watery blue background as well. This is a difficult bird to expose as well, getting that iridescence, not blowing the throat, and even getting a tiny bit of detail in that sort of black patch on down on the neck as well. So overall, really good. When I look at the image and I would be super nitpicky, I feel like the bird's kind of slightly looking up in the sky. So in a super ideal crazy world and being very nitpicky, I would want the bird to look slightly more down at me, but this is being really nitpicky and it's great. The only thing I often say with waterfowl that improves the image dramatically is to clone out the second reflection of the sun in the eye. You will notice that if there's only one highlight, the image will look much crisper and sharper than often having that double highlight that can look a little bit
Second one, yeah.
confusing to our eyes.
Yeah, that's a good tip. The one thing with the pose is if it didn't do that, maybe it wouldn't have such iridescence.
Definitely possible.
So,
That's the problem with
knows?
all the iridescent birds, isn't it? Like a bufflehead or hummingbirds. You sometimes
Yeah,
need to get
a
them in a
little.
suboptimal pose almost to get all the colors.
Overall, a great shot from Cellar Bird Photography. And I think that just about does it for this episode. We hope you've enjoyed the chat today. Let us know about this new segment, question and answer period. Should we keep doing that? Let us know down in the comments.
And of course, we thank our episode sponsor, Camera Canada. We appreciate you giving us a like for the video. And of course, if you hit that subscribe button, that would also be greatly appreciated. And we will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye.
See y'all next time.